Okay, in the back. We'll try this again. Can you hear me okay in the back then? Okay. Okay. So I'm going to focus on the Virgo cluster and start with this beautiful image of the core of the Virgo. I will focus on globular clusters in the Virgo cluster, but if I have time, I'll mention a couple of other stellar halo studies that I'm involved in. One in the local volume, so galaxies closer than 5 megaparsecs, partially resolved stellar populations in these galaxies. And after me, Emily Cunningham is going to talk about the Halo 7D survey of main sequence turn-off stars in the remote parts of the Milky Way halo. I'll say a little bit about the distant galaxy component of that if time permits. So the Virgo cluster component of my talk is based on something called the Next Generation Virgo Cluster Survey, which is a 100 square degree imaging survey in 4 filters in UG-HiPACC with the Canada, France, Hawaii telescope and MegaCam imager. And our group at Santa Cruz, you see some of the names of the people here, our group at Santa Cruz has been involved in Keck DEIMOS follow-up of globular cluster candidates and foreground stars in this NGVS survey region of Virgo. My collaborators, the main people whose work I'm relying on here, are underlined or colored in some way. The second block of people you don't recognize because they were high school students at the time they worked on this project. So a little bit about the Keck component of this. We used the 600-line grating, so medium resolution spectra covering everything from H beta through the calcium triplet. Like I said, our initial run was based on globular clusters, but they were globular clusters selected to be at least projected close to dwarf elliptical galaxies in Virgo. And then we've had a second run where we've targeted globular clusters close to ultra-diffuse galaxies. That second run has been plagued by all kinds of things, including weather, lava, earthquakes. So I won't say very much about that. We do have fillers in the form of foreground halo stars, and again, I won't say very much about those either. So here are the two Keck telescopes. That's the Laurie Hatch photo. We use the Keck 2 telescope, which has the DEIMOS spectrograph on it. And here's a quick look at the spectroscopic footprint of our survey. You see these things labeled with the letters VDGC, stands for Virgo Dwarf Globular Cluster, so dwarf galaxy globular cluster satellites. And we have 9 DEIMOS masks. Those funny shapes are the footprints of DEIMOS. It's about 16 by 4 arc minutes. The center of the Virgo cluster, M87, is marked with that green circle. Pay no attention to the gray points. This is a 5 degree by 5 degree region. This is about 1/4 the area of the full NGVS. The NGVS is 104 square degrees. This is only a 5 by 5 degree portion of that. So what we've done with the main reason for doing this survey was we recognize that dwarf elliptical galaxies have low surface brightness, and it's very difficult to say anything about stellar kinematics once you get beyond 1 or 1.5 effective radii. So we're using globular clusters as tracers of their dark matter halo. And in these 9 masks, we targeted 21 dwarf elliptical galaxies in Virgo, so there's more than 1 galaxy per mask. But a typical galaxy in Virgo has such low luminosity. These dwarf ellipticals we've targeted has the luminosity is so low that they don't have a lot of globular clusters that are bright enough to be accessible for Keck spectroscopy. So the typical number of globular clusters per galaxy is in single digits, 4 or 5. In fact, 4 is the average number. We have 21 galaxies. 84 globular cluster satellites. And if you stack the sample, that is, you look at the difference between the velocity of the globular cluster and the known velocity of the host galaxy, that's what's plotted on the y-axis. And what's plotted on the x-axis is the projected distance of the globular cluster candidate from the center of its potential host divided by the effective radius of the integrated light of the galaxy. So you can see there's a very clear finger at the origin. This is the satellite population of globular clusters. It goes out to much more than 1 or 1.5 effective radii. That's the whole point of this survey. So we can't say anything terribly meaningful about individual galaxies, but we can stack the sample using these very likely satellites. These are probably not satellites, the things marked possible. These are almost all of the things marked in black are something I'll talk about in a minute, often globular clusters, things that are not, whose parents can't easily be identified. The parent galaxy, host galaxy can't easily be identified, and a combination of those in Milky Way stars. Because you're looking at delta V, the Milky Way stars are hard to pull out from this, but if you were to look at radial velocity, the Milky Way stars are concentrated around a velocity of 0. And I should emphasize that the Virgo cluster spans a radial velocity range that goes from minus 500 kilometers per second to plus 3,000. So just based on velocity alone, you can't completely reliably separate stars from Milky Way stars from Virgo cluster globular clusters. So here's an attempt to do the stacking of the same globular cluster sample, but an attempt to constrain the dark matter mass as a function of radius for this composite sample. That's what that black line represents, and the individual stars are attempting to constrain individual galaxies. And you'll see that some of these stars have huge error bars on them because they have just a handful of globular clusters, but some of them have in excess of 10 globular clusters, and you can get meaningful constraints on those individual galaxies. They tend to be the more massive, larger systems. Now, this is work in progress, and this is something that Eric Peng is currently working on. We have some results from this sample that Lisa Toloba published earlier this year. Actually, she published a UDG sample earlier this year. She published a sample of these globular clusters where she tested for rotation of the globular cluster system. She did that a couple of years ago. One more thing we can do with the spectra, in addition to dynamics, is to look at the chemical composition information in these spectra. So if you look at co-added spectra now, because the individual spectra have very low signal to noise, if you look at co-added spectra, what we've done here is compared the population of globular clusters that appear to have dwarf elliptical hosts with globular clusters that don't have identifiable host galaxies in Virgo. This is what we're calling orphans. And as you've all seen, globular clusters have a bimodal color distribution in Virgo. The population we're studying here has a dominant blue peak. There's hardly any red globular clusters in the sample, but just to compare apples to apples, we took the blue globular cluster subset, which is the majority of our globular clusters, and compared the chemical properties, the magnesium B line strength, the H beta line strength, between globular cluster satellites of DEs and non-satellites, what we're calling orphans. The orphans did have parents once upon a time. The parents have been disrupted by, presumably, M87. They've become part of the M87 halo. So what we're comparing are former globular clusters that are satellites of former galaxies in Virgo that have been cannibalized by M87 compared to globular clusters that are satellites of surviving dwarf galaxies in Virgo. And what we can see from this, the main signal is the magnesium seems to be stronger in the orphans, in the galaxies, in the globular clusters that belong to galaxies that are currently disrupted. So we think that the main halo of this is telling us something about the luminosity or mass of the host galaxy, of the former host galaxies of these orphans. And just on the face of this metallicity evidence and invoking mass metallicity relation in galaxies, we would conclude that the main halo of M87, the globular clusters in the main halo of M87, come from galaxies that are significantly more massive than the DEs, if this metallicity evidence is to be taken at face value. Okay. So the globular clusters are more metal-rich. The orphan globular clusters are more metal-rich than the DE satellites. Okay. I want to say a little bit more about the orphan globular clusters. It turns out the orphan globular clusters are of two varieties. So I'm showing you results from a paper by Alessia Longobardi that was accepted for publication about a month ago. What you're seeing in the left panel is a velocity histogram. This is heliocentric velocities. And the spike at 0 are Milky Way foreground stars. This is not the Keck sample, by the way. This is a MMT hectospec sample of velocities shown here. The second population of objects that are on the, I'm going to see if I can point this. This population of objects here that are that have two dashed lines associated with them. If you study that population closely, you'll see that it's very well represented by the sum of two Gaussians. Sum of two Gaussians, one narrow, one broad. The narrow one has a velocity, has a mean velocity of 1,300 kilometers per second, which is exactly the mean velocity of M87. It has a velocity dispersion of 400 kilometers per second. This is the 1D velocity dispersion, which again is similar to what you'd expect for the central regions of M87. The second component, the broader component, shown here with this lower, broader Gaussian, has a velocity dispersion of 700 instead of 400, and a mean velocity that's shifted slightly to the left. You can probably even see that in this fit. Shifted to 1100 instead of 1300. And the fact that 3 Gaussians fit better than 2 is sort of demonstrated here. And here is sort of the probabilities in velocity space. If something falls in this gray zone, light gray zone, it's likely to be one of these things that belong to the broad Gaussian component. You can think of these as the intra-cluster globular clusters. 1100 happens to be the mean velocity of galaxies in Virgo. So M87 is sloshing around relative to the mean velocity of galaxies in Virgo, and you can see that in this globular cluster population. We are starting to explore the differences in metallicity between these two globular cluster populations, the two orphans. Thank you. And it looks very clear that the intra-cluster population has a lower metallicity than the M87 population. Again, the narrower population is the M87 halo population. And you can see the parameters down here. 1300 is the mean, 400 is the sigma. It is both more metal-rich than the other population, than the intra-cluster population, and it's more centrally concentrated. So in terms of radial distribution, in terms of velocity, and in terms of metallicity, there appear to be these two distinct but spatially and in velocity overlapping populations of globular clusters. This is what we had dubbed orphans. Now, this is all spectroscopic work, and it's really painstaking because globular clusters at the distance of Virgo are faint, and they occupy a large region of the sky, so it's really difficult work. So I'm going to show you some results based on pure photometric work on globular clusters in the core of Virgo. So in the NGVS survey, in addition to the UG-IZ bands, there was a central region of the cluster that was imaged in two more filters. It was imaged in the R filter, so there you have UG-RIZ instead of UG-IZ. And very importantly, you have the K-band, the 2.2 micron K-band. And as you know, K-band detectors are not as large as optical detectors. Near IR detectors can't easily cover the same kind of patches of sky in a single go. So the K-band imaging only covers the central 2 by 2 degrees. Okay, not 10 by 10 for the entire NGVS, but only the central 2 by 2. And the results I'm about to show you are based on that central 4 square degrees. It's centered on M87. So what we have is a photometric sample of globular clusters selected by Eric Peng using an extreme deconvolution method that uses two kinds of information. It uses broadband colors, UG, he doesn't use R, he uses UG, IZ, and K short photometry. And he uses the fact that most globular clusters, even at the distance of Virgo, can be told apart from stars just based on image morphology. I shouldn't say most. Some fraction of them can be told apart. If you have HSD imaging, you can really tell every globular cluster apart from a star. If you have good ground-based imaging, you can tell some fraction of them apart from stars, just based on the fact that the globular clusters are slightly fuzzier than the point spread function, even at the distance of Virgo. So this has resulted in the most complete map of globular clusters in Virgo. And we're talking about the cluster core that's going out to about a radius of 200 kpc. So let me show you how the globular clusters are selected. The color coding here, blue, these blue points represent globular clusters. The red points represent background galaxies. And the yellow points represent foreground stars. You can see the usual pileup of stars in two color groups. You have stars piled up at about the main sequence turn-off color. And you see this in any stellar color magnitude diagram. And you see late-type stars pile up at very red colors. Now, reassuringly, this pileup of colors and this identification based on extreme deconvolution picks out a set of objects that are not very fuzzy. This axis is the inverse of a concentration parameter. So the lower the object is, the more compact its light distribution. So the globular clusters, as I said, are slightly more extended than stars. And the galaxies span a range. There's some compact galaxies, and there are a lot of very extended galaxies. The galaxies, if you look at them in color space, they actually separate quite nicely because globular galaxies are typically mixes of stars, mixes of black bodies. And so in color space, they separate nicely from the stellar locus, which is close to a single black body. Now, of course, it's a sequence of temperature. And what is really critical is the stellar locus is curved. If you use the K-band, the stellar locus is significantly curved. Globular clusters, of course, represent a mix of stars. If the stellar locus were a straight line, and you picked a bunch of points from a straight line, their average would land on that straight line. And you wouldn't be able to separate globular clusters from individual stars. Because the locus is curved, the average of points along the locus doesn't land on the locus. The easiest way to imagine this is imagine a locus that's a circle and uniformly distributed points along a circle. If you take their average, the average is going to land at the center of the circle, not on the rim. And this is that kind of effect that's going on. The blue objects, the globular clusters, are slightly displaced in the direction of the inside of the curvature of that locus. Thanks. So using this for separation, Eric made this map that certainly made my jaw drop. This is a Hess diagram of globular clusters in the core of Virgo. This is not an image of the light in Virgo. The cyan circles, the cyan ellipses, represent known galaxies in Virgo. The sizes of the cyan ellipse, each ellipse represents the effective radius. I think it's 4 times the effective radius, or 5 times the effective radius. So you can see the locations of known galaxies, but the underlying heat map is a density map of globular clusters, photometrically identified globular clusters in the center of Virgo. And I just want to point out a few things. You can see some galaxies that have a very high specific frequency of globular clusters. That is, the bigger cyan circles also tend to be luminous galaxies in Virgo. And some of them, like those two in those two boxes there, have a healthy globular cluster population. Some have an entirely anemic, non-existent almost globular cluster population. Look at the galaxies in those circles. There's a hardly discernible globular cluster population. So there's a wide range of specific frequency across Virgo. If you look at the sizes of the globular cluster distributions, in some cases they're much bigger than the integrated light distribution, like you see in those two cases. But in some cases, the heat map blob lies well inside the, well inside that ellipse, indicating that it's a much more compact, spatially compact distribution of globular clusters. You see spatial offsets of the globular cluster centroid from the centroid of the galaxy. In most cases, those are related to interactions. You see some very complex looking globular cluster distribution. Again, those appear to be associated with tidal interaction. I'll show you the actual image, integrated light image of that system of two galaxies, and you can see that the globular clusters certainly are, show signs of interaction. In other words, you can use the globular clusters to trace the low surface brightness outer parts of these galaxies. This one is even more dramatic. All right. So in my last couple of minutes, I want to quickly advertise this work we are doing as part of the Pisces survey. This is imaging of Centaurus and Sculptor with MegaCam. We've actually extended this to M81 in the north. We've done spectroscopic follow-up. We started with a galaxy that's 3.5 megaparsecs away. This galaxy, NGC 4449, that was discovered by others to have this faint tidal stream. Now, at the distance of 3.5 megaparsecs, even red giants at the tip of the red giant branch are faint, and it takes very long exposures with Keck to get a spectrum. But if you look at what look like spots of light in ground-based images, they're often not individual stars. Rather, they're upward fluctuations, upward surface brightness fluctuations. So this spot of light, this spot of light, that spot of light, they're not individual stars. They are upward fluctuations in the surface brightness fluctuations. People use surface brightness fluctuation to measure distances. We're taking advantage of only the upward fluctuations to take the concentration of light that nature has provided in one point on the sky, take its spectrum, co-add it with other blends, and pull out a velocity in that way. And we've done this now for a few different galaxies. Elisa has published a few of these, Elisa Tulova has. And you can see that the co-added spectrum, even though these stars are faint, we're talking about I magnitudes of 24th as our limit. We can pull out a calcium triplet, we can pull out an H alpha, we can get a velocity. We can even measure things like sort of an average metallicity. We are now doing this for a disrupting system in NGC 253 in the Sculptor group. And that elongated galaxy, that's a star count map with a Deimos overlay. We're doing this in Centaurus A with streams like this. The Centaurus A is too far south. We're doing that with VLT and VMOS. These are the people involved in that, the people who are really leading the charge on that part. And finally, I want to mention something about the Halo 7D survey, which is really a survey that looks at the remote Milky Way halo, but also looks through the remote Milky Way halo at distant galaxies. So this started out as a HST archival program to measure proper motions of stars using background galaxies as the cosmic wallpaper that's static. Now, we anticipate being able to measure the proper motions of something like 1,000 stars, but we have a Keck spectroscopic program that some of the people in this room, Emily's been leading the charge on this, but some others in the room are involved, David and Sandy are. We have spectra of about 2,000 galaxies, not 1,500, 2,000 galaxies, with really long integration times. So Emily's going to talk more about this in the next talk, and Alice Deason was also, played a really important role in getting this survey off the ground. Kevin McKinnon, who's here, is working on metallicities from this. Emily's working on halo dynamics. So I'll put up my summary slide and take questions. Thank you.
We have time for a quick question. Could the next speaker?
Hi. I'm sorry if I missed it during the talk, but the two populations of the intracluster globular clusters that you said in Virgo, Do they have you looked at the kinematics? In other words, are they more, are they separated in terms of tangential orbits or more like radial orbits or?
All we have are radial velocities, of course. So what we can see is, all we can study is the line of sight velocity distribution as a function of radius. There doesn't seem to be a very strong radial variation of each of the two components. The relative mix of the two changes as you go out. You have much more of the narrow component, the 400 kilometer per second sigma component in the inner parts. You have much more of the 700 kilometer per second component in the outer part. So if anything, the velocity dispersion goes up, but we think it's because it's the interplay, the changing mix of two populations. Happy to talk offline.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
Okay, so let's